everyone. My name is Fariel, and Lisa and I are today hosting a webinar to talk about how to conduct mock interviews, especially given that the PhD admissions interview season is coming up. So we'll be going through some slides that we put together, but feel free to interrupt us at any point. And we'll also have a Q&A session at the end for any of your questions. So what we're hoping that you'll gain today as a mentor is that you'll become more familiar with how to structure and run a successful mock interview, how to provide constructive and actionable feedback to your mentee, um, and to hopefully feel prepared to support them and provide them with the appropriate resources. And I'd say like the eventual goal is that you also feel supported by the Project Short community and that you feel like you can turn to us for any questions or any advice. Okay. So just to start off, this is something we all know, but I'd like to just reiterate that mock interviews are really crucial for applicants. And this is for a lot of reasons, but it really helps the applicant practice under realistic conditions. And this is really helpful for them to just get a better feeling of how they perform under stress and pressure. It also helps them build confidence. It can help them improve clarity and delivery of their message the more that they practice. They can also anticipate common questions, and so they can kind of have answers to some of the typical standard interview questions. They also get the opportunity to get constructive feedback, which is really important, and that allows them to identify areas that they can improve on. And so we really encourage you to sign up to conduct them because they're a really valuable resource and it's very helpful for the candidates. So, first off, let's talk a little bit about how we can run a mock interview. So, there are really three stages to the mock interview process once you sign up to lead one with one of the mentees. So, first off, let's talk about what we should be doing before the interview. So I would say the first thing to do is to reach out early in order to introduce yourself and confirm logistics, including date, time, format, and length of the interview. This really depends on the field that you're in and the school that the applicant is applying to. Every program does things a little differently, so you kind of want to get a better gist of what they are expecting their interviews to look like. I would also recommend that you ask for key materials, specifically the applicant's CV and their personal statement, and this will really help you customize the interview questions that you'll be asking them. And I think it's also really helpful to clarify expectations. So I would encourage you to ask them for what they want to focus on. Some people might want to prioritize practice and research questions and how to answer those. Some other people might want to work on their storytelling or general communication. And the last thing I also recommend doing is to kind of set the tone for a supportive, constructive experience. So just make it very friendly and welcoming to kind of take off or ease some of the stress that they might be experiencing. So once you schedule your interview virtually, there are certain things that we encourage you to do during the interview. First off, you should introduce yourself, kind of explain the flow, and remind them that this is practice. You want to also create a professional but encouraging tone. And what this means is to just kind of create an environment where they feel comfortable, but it kind of also mimics how the interview environment would be. We also encourage you to ask a balanced mix of questions. So you want to ask some research focused questions like their motivation, their past experiences, future directions. And you also want to talk about fit and behavioral questions as well. So why this program, why they're applying to this school, any challenges they've been through. Um, we also encourage you to customize the questions to the applicant. So I said it just a little bit ago, but this is really important because it makes your experience feel more realistic. And then throughout the interview, we also encourage you to take notes on clarity and organization. So anything that you think the applicant should work on. And finally, and this is really, really important, but I would encourage you to manage time and so the session feels authentic. So if you feel that the applicant is kind of going on about a certain question, you can feel free to kind of interrupt them to make it feel more realistic. And yeah. So we put together some common interview questions that come up. So there are the behavioral and fit questions. And we've all been through this experience, right? If we're here today. So these might ring a bell. But I would say the behavioral and fit questions that we typically hear about or get during these interviews is the faculty asking you to tell them about yourself. They ask you what brought you to this field, why you're applying to this school, to this program, what motivates you to pursue research, how do you handle setbacks in research, why do you want to work with me or my lab. And there are also the research focused questions that involve asking about your previous research project, any major findings in that project, the next steps or future directions in that project. And for example, they can get even more detailed and ask you why you chose a specific method or a specific approach. Another question that I personally had or got asked during my interviews, or one of my interviews, was about any current big open questions in the field and how you see fitting in as a researcher. And this is something that a lot of people might not be prepared for. So I encourage you to ask that during the interview. You can also ask about which paper has influenced their thinking lately. So these are just some questions that we put together. There are more questions that are on the Project Short website at this link right here. So if you go to the resource page, you'll be able to find a list of questions they can ask during the faculty interview or during the interview with graduate students. So once you are done with the interview portion, there are certain things that you also want to follow up on. So the first thing I would do is to begin with reflection. And what I mean by that is that you want to ask the applicant what they think went well and what could be improved. And so this really helps them, kind of nudges them to just reflect on what they've done and to be more mindful. You also want to share feedback that's specific and actionable. So you want to highlight their strengths, things that went super well or went well during the interview, but you also want to identify areas for growth and things that they should work on. Overall, I would say to balance critique with encouragement. So this is what we call the sandwich feedback technique, where you give them some praise, you also give some criticism, and then you end it with praise. You also want to make sure to offer next steps, so things that they can tangibly work on. And I would say giving them just realistic next steps that they can work on is really helpful, instead of just like a big overall message that can feel a little overwhelming to them. And I would always end on a positive note and thank them for this experience and offer to follow up with them over email if they have any questions.
So for the next part of our webinar, we're going to talk a bit about how you can prepare your mentee for interviews. And so to bring us to, yes, for a general look at where we are now in the application timeline. So this is mostly for US applications, but I do expect that generally a lot of PhD interviews will be taking place all around the world in the next 3 to 4 months. But a lot of your mentees are going to be in the process of doing some last minute, revisions, actually submitting their applications. And in December through February is most often when people get their interview invitations for the interviews to be taking place next year in January to March. And so now is actually a great time to start thinking about preparing for the interview and talking with your mentees about it. So on the next slide, we think that one of the most helpful things you can do in your discussions with your mentees is to share your own interview experiences. So how did that go? Where were you interviewing? What was the interview day like? All of that is a super great resource that you can provide for your mentees. And as well, you can get to know how much experience your mentee has with this type of interview. So have they ever, you know, done this before? Some of the interview formats for me were very new, where it was like kind of a weekend with multi-day events, kind of. And if there's specific things that they want more help with. And again, I think starting early is always helpful for this process. So very generally, the things that we think you could possibly help your mentees with the most, since they are the ones that know their own experiences and their interests and skills. A lot of times the key is to be able to communicate that effectively and be able to actually articulate it in an interview. And that's where, as mentors, we can really help to figure out how to communicate what they're trying to say better. And so throughout this process, you want to encourage the applicant to really get to know themselves. So things like know their own motivations, know why a particular program is interesting to them, and then also to know who they're interviewing with. So things about the program, the school, the professors, and more concretely, helping with preparing and practicing answers to common questions is a really straightforward way to help your mentees. And so in terms of actually helping them practice interview answers, I'm sure many of you have heard of the STAR method, but I'll go over it really briefly. But I found that it helps a lot for both the behavioral fit type questions and for research questions. So very broadly, the STAR method is a structure for you to answer any question with. You'd start with the situation, essentially the context of what's happening, and then talk about the specific task. So if there's a specific problem that you're addressing in the lab or in some other context. And then A is for action. So this is what you actually did in order to solve that problem or tackle some challenge. And then the last one is really key, which is to explain the results of your action and to connect it back to the original question. And so broadly here, they're giving, some recommendations for how much time to spend on each one of them. So, it makes the most sense to spend the most time actually talking about what you did. And I think in helping your mentees try out this method, what I found helps is that you can work with them to change one of their interview answers to fit into this kind of format and just play it out with them and see if it seems to help them communicate better. And so in terms of getting to know the program and doing your research in advance, these are some of the questions that you might prompt them to think about. So they might be asked which faculty they want to interview with. And so then they should know what each interviewer works on. And generally, you can find that out through lab websites or maybe picking out one or two interesting papers to look at. And they should also really know the program that they're interviewing for. So, for example, if it's a rotational program, you should probably know that in advance and know something about the school. And throughout this process, I think people naturally then kind of come up with questions that they'll have for faculty and for students that they meet during the interview process. And it's also good for them to reflect on what makes them a good fit for the program throughout this process. And so for the next two slides, I'll be talking a bit about interview etiquette, both in person and virtually. So very generally for in-person interviews, I think they are expecting business or business casual dress. And in my opinion, it's always better to be a little too formal than too informal. And as always, being on time and being professional and respectful is of the utmost importance. I think I'd also explain to your mentees that if they're invited for in-person interviews, it might be a multi-day kind of situation with one-on-one interviews. They might be in some research presentations, Q&A sessions, there might be meals with faculty and other students. And it's important for them to know that they need to be professional throughout all of these different events that might occur. And also, in case they didn't know, usually the travel, lodging, and food are covered or reimbursed by these programs, so they shouldn't have to undergo financial stress to be able to attend. And then in terms of virtual interviews, I'm hearing from a lot of programs that they're still doing some form of virtual interviewing, often in the stage of in the form of a first stage interview that's virtual, and then they select some number of applicants from that for in-person interviews. So I think it's still important to prepare for virtual interviews, and many of these same things still apply. So timeliness, respect, etc. And then some more specific things are, to make sure you have an appropriate background, to test all your technology, finding a quiet location. I've heard that sometimes at universities, they have private interview rooms that you can book for short periods of time. And as well, when you're doing a virtual interview, you really only have your video to convey what body language might do in an in-person setting. So it's important to pay attention to posture and facial expression a little more. And since most of our mock interviews will be taking place virtually, I think this is a good chance to also give some feedback on this. Like if you notice you can't really hear them or there's distracting things going on, those would be helpful things to give feedback on during a mock interview. And broadly, we put together some do's and don'ts in terms of the interview process. So definitely help your mentees practice and prepare for common interview questions. A super common one that's, I think, deceptively hard to answer is the tell me about yourself. And I think if you're unprepared for that, it can be very easy to kind of go on for a while without a clear purpose. And also recommend that you make sure your mentees review their previous application materials. What we don't recommend is that we really don't recommend memorizing answers. So practice lots, but not memorize. And we also don't suggest bringing a slideshow or presentation to your interview. We've been hearing about this happening sometimes, and we think that it detracts a little bit from being present with your interviewer. And in preparing for your interview, they don't need to worry about reading all the faculty members' papers. And of course, we don't want to encourage exaggerating or lying when we're answering questions. So some last points are that interviews are for the applicants too. And I know that interviewing can often be a very stressful process for applicants. So I think if that's the case for your mentee, you can try to reframe it more as an opportunity for them to get to know the school and the program better, because it really is an opportunity for them to talk to people in the program, talk to their potential mentors, get to know if they would actually like it, and they should make the most of that. So this is hopefully something that can help them in case they're feeling anxious or stressed. And then the last note is that after the interview, we recommend that your mentees send thank you letters within 24 hours after the interview. So this would be to the people that interviewed you and perhaps also to someone who coordinated the interview process. Those would all be appropriate people to send thank you letters to. There's lots of thank you letter templates online, but it doesn't need to be super long or anything. It just has to be sincere. And I've also found that after interviewing with each program, it can help to write some notes for yourself or for the mentee themselves to have later on as they're trying to decide what program they might want to accept. And we also want to make sure that you and your mentees know that we have lots of resources available. So for your mentees specifically, we'll be hosting a workshop on interviewing in December, so make sure they watch out for that. And then mock interviews will be available, so also encourage your mentees to sign up for that, since I think doing a mock interview with someone completely new is a very different experience than with your mentor that you've been working with for a long time. And then for you guys, the mentors, we also have this big list of resources that we'll send out. So lots of places to get more details on this. So yeah, now it's the Q&A, so we can kind of discuss anything that you guys are more curious about or anything that's come up in your own mentoring relationships. Yeah, Brianna?